Thank you, and thanks for the big round for Gustav. Okay, well, welcome to Rewiring Your Brain with test-driven thinking in parentheses in C++, but I have a confession to make there. When I was putting this material together, I knew I was going to be doing training all week in Copenhagen in testing and TDD, so I thought, I'll do something TDD related. I can put some material together, and it'll all be in C++. By the time the material all came together, there's not actually much C++ in there. It's all very general, but it's in the key of C++. You can think of it that way. It definitely applies. So sorry about that. So who am I? I'm Phil Nash. You can get me at Phil_Nash on Twitter while that's still running. When that dies, then I'm also on Mastodon, and that's my Mastodon handle there. Currently working at Sonar. If you don't know Sonar, we do static analysis tools. So it's all code quality related. It all fits. But we're not going to be talking about any of that tonight. I'm going to talk about TDD and specifically test-driven thinking, which is a slightly different spin on it, and had some interesting things to say. So I wanted to try to distill it down to a talk and see how it goes. Let's see if this works. Yeah, there we go. So I wanted to start with a question. Why do we write tests? Peel it right back to the fundamentals. And in fact, I mentioned I work at Sonar, and we have a quite a strong company culture of things like always starting with the why, we say. So I thought we'd do that and start with the why do we write tests? But actually I want to go back even further than that and just take that off and say, do we even write tests? So maybe I'll ask you, not put you on the spot, but just say, first of all, who regularly writes tests for their current code base? Not necessarily all of them, not necessarily before, but just it's a regular part of your workflow. So maybe half, just under. There's a few borderlines I can see, as usual. All right, who's currently working on a code base or a part of your code base that has probably like 90% or more test coverage? Doesn't matter if you haven't got a test coverage tool, just like finger in the air. You think it's good test coverage. Maybe 1.5 people. Okay, so it's very scientific counting. So yeah, not many. That's normal. It's I was going to say it's fine. It's not fine, but it's okay. All right, who thinks they should probably be writing more tests? Okay. So 1 or 2 people didn't put their hands up. So let's go back to the why. Why do we write tests? And in fact, I still don't quite want to get to this question yet. I want to throw another one at you. Why do we not write tests? Or why do we not write enough tests? I think that pretty much brings everyone into this question now. I always feel like we should do more. Well, let's have a think about it for a moment. What stops you from writing more tests? Don't need to say anything. I'm going to put up just a few suggestions, things that I often hear, and just compare that to what you're thinking about now. So maybe you think it's just extra work. I know my code works. Why do I need to write some extra stuff just to show that again? Well, that's what some people think. Maybe you think it slows you down. And the flip side to that is, I don't have enough time to write tests. It's really the same thing. If they didn't slow you down, well, it wouldn't take extra time, would it? So it's probably actually the number one reason that people think of. Maybe they just distract you from what you're actually doing. I want to get this task done. I don't need to be distracted by all the tests. That's busy work. Or maybe you just find testing boring. Well, we'll come back to those questions in a moment, but whether you think these are actually valid reasons or not, they are reasons that people give for not writing enough tests. So we'll need to address them somehow. Just one other question I've got for you, which is not going to seem related to this, but we'll come back and link it up in a minute. Who here got into software development originally as a hobby project? Or something you did in your free time or for fun? So just under half, that's quite good. But perhaps along the way, if it did become a professional practice, then you sort of lost a bit of that sense of fun that you started out with. Well, maybe we'll see if we can get some of that back. But let's go back to that question. We still haven't quite asked it yet. Why do we write tests? Well, we've seen that there is at least a perception of some obstacles, some trade-offs. Is it worth it? Why do we write tests? What are we getting out of it to make it worth it? Let's do the same exercise again. Just have a think. What are the reasons that we actually write tests? And then I'm going to put up some suggestions. And we can compare. So perhaps the number one thing people think of is to catch bugs. And yeah, we can certainly write tests to catch bugs. Not the only reason, by any means. Maybe not even the main reason. But it's probably the first thing most people think of. What about this one? To encode or write down your expectations. I want the code to do this when I run it. How do I verify that that actually happens? And write it down in a way that actually communicates that intention to somebody else as well. Maybe to catch regressions. Maybe a bug has surfaced out in the field or a colleague has caught it and you think, how did that slip through my test? I'm going to write a specific test for that particular bug so it never happens again. That's a regression test. I'm sure most of us have done that. What about this one then? To use as documentation. Because if you think about it, a lot of the tests we write are just examples of how to use the code that you've written. Especially if it's like an API or a library or something like that you intend other people to be able to use. They say, how do you use your code? Oh, just go and look at the test, that will show you. It is a bit of a double-edged sword, though, because oftentimes your tests will be probing at the corner cases and the usages you don't actually want people to use, but you just want to make sure it works anyway. So you do need to try somehow to make it clear which type of test it is, so that people don't, I had that before. I did it like you're tested. That's not what I wanted. So just be careful with that. But otherwise, very good executable documentation. Can't get out of sync with the code. That's pretty good. Well, that's a handful of reasons. Who got all four? Anyone? Ah, okay, well done. Well, here's some more for you then. Right, and this is not exhaustive. Like, I've been doing this TDD training now for a few years on and off. And usually when I ask it, I'll ask the question, why do we write tests? And have a flip chart up and I'll just take all the suggestions down. Take a photo at the end and I'll collect them all together. So I've got dozens and dozens of them now. There's always a few new ones. But I thought these ones are particularly important. I'm not going to go through them all individually. I don't have time for that. What I do want to note though, is that all the ones on the right hand side, you only really get these benefits if you do TDD. If you write your tests first and you follow your TDD practices. Whereas these ones we get from pretty much any type of testing. So there's some things you have to take that extra step to get the benefit of. So let's come back to this one then. Why we weren't writing tests or not enough. Because we do have these things that may be slowing us down. Well, let's pick this apart a little bit more. What if I told you that instead of them being extra work, they'll actually help you to avoid rework and reduce the amount of work you do in total? Okay, then that can cancel out that first one. Or what if instead of slowing you down, they can actually speed you up when you consider the total time you spend on a particular project at least. And actually maybe even you get that payoff sooner than you expect. And what if I said that instead of distracting you from what you're doing, they can actually keep you focused not only on what you're doing, but the most important parts? Well, that would definitely cancel out the distraction excuse. And what if I said instead of being boring, tests could actually be fun? All right, well, all sounds too good to be true, yeah? So how? How will it achieve all that? Well, let's have a look at 3 particular areas. Habit forming, what I'm calling dopamine triggers, and externalizing your brain. Let's have a look at each of these in turn. So, habit forming. You may have seen something like this before, the sort of cycle of habit building. Comes straight from psychology. there's a cue or a trigger, something happens in your environment that you want to lead to a behavior. Well, you can only do that if when you perform the behavior, you get some sort of reward. And if you can link those three things together and repeat this cycle enough, then that builds a habit in your brain. Until in time, you don't actually need the reward. The cue or the trigger is enough. That's how you build a habit. And it turns out that if you do that, it's really hard to break the habit. It's usually more about breaking habits that we have the trouble with. The only way to do it really is to create a new habit in its place, to do something else instead. Well, how does this work in terms of writing tests? Well, the cue can be, well, when you want to write some code. The behavior is, what if I write it with the test? Ideally, with the test first, but we'll come on to that in a minute. Just associating the test with the code is the behavior that we want. What's the reward? Well, there's actually a few. We'll dig into the others in a minute, but just for now, get immediate positive feedback. And you can see that's in green. If you're using a test framework, when all your tests pass, they go green, don't they? And it's like, oh, yeah, that feels good. I want to do that again. So you start to build the habit. So it makes sense that the more times you can do this loop, the stronger a habit that's going to build. So it won't feel natural to begin with because it takes time to build a habit. But as long as you pay attention to this reward, then you will actually build a habit. And it will be a habit that becomes hard to break. And that's the funny thing about the way we work as humans. When something is unnatural, it feels like, oh, I'm never going to get into this. Once you build the habit, it's like, I can't do it any other way. It becomes your natural approach to writing code is to do it with tests. Don't believe me? Well, the next section will make this even stronger. I've got one other slide actually. I already said that. It's hard. It's actually harder not to follow a habit than to follow it. So if you can get to that point, then you don't even need to think about it. But the next section I wanted to talk about is dopamine triggers. And this overlaps. That instant feedback, that's one of these dopamine triggers. When you see that green, it's a point of gamification. Don't underestimate how powerful that is. I mean, this whole industry is built on this. We'll use it to our advantage. But that's not the only dopamine trigger. Let's have a look at the definition of dopamine from Wikipedia. It says in popular culture and media, dopamine is often portrayed as the main chemical of pleasure. That's how we usually think about it. But it goes on to say, but the current opinion in pharmacology is that dopamine instead confers motivational salience. And what does that mean? It means that it's not the reward in itself, but it's the thing that makes you seek the reward, which is a slight shift. So really it's those sticky patterns that, like I said with the habit building, yeah, you've got the reward that's motivating you to begin with, but even when you take the reward away, the pattern actually keeps you going. That's what the dopamine's doing. So what other parts of testing and TDD lead to dopamine triggers? So here's a few things. Well, we talked about seeing a test pass, just getting that first green. That's a little dopamine trigger. Seeing a test go from red to green seems like the same thing, but this is like if you're struggling with maybe a bug or a hard to fix issue for a long time, and then it goes green. Ah, yes, we got it. Yeah, got your little reward. So it's slightly different. There's also what I call race to green. Now, if you're doing TDD, we'll look at the TDD cycle in a minute. But when you're at the green stage, the bit where you're trying to make your test pass, that's the only thing you're focused on. You're not worried about clean code, good architecture, good design principles. There's a separate step for that. So you actually have permission to just hack the code until it works, which is where that fun comes in. That's what we used to do before we actually learned that we had to actually maintain the code as well. It gives you some of that fun back. You do need to do the refactoring step as well, though. We'll come to that. And also, in that refactoring step, well, you don't have to worry about making the test pass anymore. They're already passing. You just need to clean the code up and not break it. Which again, it's a different thing. And that actually feels good as well. yeah, I've made this code a bit better. And the tests say I didn't break anything. Great. They're all dopamine hits that you keep getting in tight loops continuously, fueling that habit. And effectively rewiring your brain. So really all we have to do is just pay attention to those moments and actually revel in them. So let's look at the third area, externalizing your brain. What do I mean by this one? I think this may be the one that I've seen other people talking about the least, but for me, it's one of the most important parts of TDD. And we're actually going to look at the TDD cycle as part of this. But as humans, we have what we call an open loop system. So typically that means we need to interact with other humans to work optimally. But it doesn't necessarily mean to be other humans. Like if we just write down our faults, we can actually hold on to faults for longer and build bigger faults and develop whole fault technologies that we wouldn't be able to hold in our heads at one time. So we're using that external paper or whatever it is as like almost a continuation of our brains. And of course these days we can do that with computers. So whether it's again just taking notes or in some other way putting your faults down in a way that you can pick them up again later. If you think about it, in a way, that's like serializing a part of your brain. You can deserialize it again later and frees you up to be able to think about other things or bigger topics. All right, how does that really fit into this? Well, let's look at another type of loop. This is the TDD cycle. Who's seen something like this before? A few people. So it's sometimes called the red-green refactor cycle. So the red and the green are obvious. I sort of made up the orange for refactor. So this is my version of it. So if you haven't looked at TDD before, or even if you have, it's useful to have a refresher. It's quite easy to follow. We always start, and this is important, we start here with a failing test. And if we haven't done that, we're not doing TDD. Doesn't mean it's wrong. There's perfectly valid ways of testing that don't start with a failing test, but you're not doing TDD, and it's worth realizing, because you don't get some of the benefits. You start with a failing test, has to be failing. And there's also the word test there, that's doing a lot of work. You might think of a unit test in a test framework, but it could just be that you've written some code that calls a function that doesn't exist yet, and the compiler is telling you that doesn't build. Well, that's a type of test. You're using the compiler as a test framework, in effect. And there's other ways as well, but they're the main two. So that's what we're doing there. We don't move on until we've got a failing test. Then we move on to the green step, where we write just the code to make the test pass. We already said that it's just that code. Race to green, get the simplest thing that works in, worry about cleaning it up later. So a bit of a hacker mentality. And then we move to the refactor step, where we say, do we need to clean this up? Do we need to refactor it to employ these design principles that we know will help us? And then finally, and this is a bit that's not usually included in the cycle, but there's a separate step where we can ask, are we actually done? Or do we need to move to the next test? And there's a reason that I've separated that out, which we'll come on to in a minute. That's the basic TDD cycle. There's a little bit more depth you can go into, but that should be fairly understandable. Let's take a slightly different view on this. I divide this up into what I call different mindsets or mental roles that you can take, because just bringing psychology back into it again. The way the human mind works, it's very associative. You ever done the thing where you walk into a room and can't remember why you came in? And you go back to where you came from and, now I remember. Because we're so sensitive to our context. It actually changes the way you think about things, brings different mental resources to bear. And it's the same when you're working on code. When you're down at the code face, hacking away, you've got a different set of mental resources to when you're just sitting back with a sheet of paper thinking about the design. It's almost like you're a different person playing a different role. And it's actually quite hard to move between those on demand. So here's what TDD does for you. When you are writing your failing test, that's when you're thinking about your high-level design, your requirements, user experience, all those sort of things. Sitting back with that sheet of paper and having thought about all those things and decided what the next thing you want to do is, that's when you write it down as a test. That's effectively you serializing all that thinking into the code. And now your test is going to do the work of telling you when you've met whatever it was you decided you were going to do. So now you don't have to worry about that anymore. You're freed up to take on a different mental role, which is this race to green sort of hacker mentality. I just want to hack away at code until I make this test pass. It's very liberating not having to worry about any of the other stuff anymore and just focus entirely on that. And of course get that dopamine hit at the end when it goes green. Then we can take on a slightly different role. Once everything's green and we know we're safe, now we can focus just on keeping the code clean, the design well factored, employing these design principles. But that's the only thing we have to worry about. We don't have to worry about changing the behavior. We don't have to worry about any of the high-level requirements. That's all taken care of. The test is keeping us honest again. But notice the are we done is back over into the high-level design requirements mindset. Once we're done and we can switch back, we're actually in a different place mentally, where we're thinking about what is the next thing we need to actually do. And the more you do this, the more easily you flip between them because you start to trust the process. I don't have to worry about that, the tests have me. So you'll find it much easier to make this switch back. And you can stop going off and developing code just because it was fun or because you saw something that needed improving over there and you go down some rabbit hole and got you away from what you were meant to be doing. I mean, you can still do that if you want, but you don't fall into the trap so much. You just start thinking about what you need to be thinking about at the appropriate time. So you may actually finish sooner as a result. So those are the 3 areas of TDD that can effectively rewire your brain. So building the habit in the first place. It doesn't come naturally overnight. You need to do it a few times, but do pay attention to those little dopamine hits that you get along the way. Gamify them so that you build the habit, you get that sense of fun back. Look for all of the dopamine triggers and rely on TDD, serializing your brain, externalizing it, so you can focus just on the parts that you need to at any particular time to become more productive and enjoy it more. You can't really do better than that, I think. And slightly sooner than expected, that I think is the end of my material for now. Thank you.